Lucas Mendez kept his head low as he walked down the crowded hallway of Winston High. The cacophony of laughter and chatter reverberated off the walls, but Lucas moved through it like a ghost, unseen and unheard. His broad shoulders and towering frame should have made him an imposing figure, but instead, they marked him as a target. Whispers of mockery trailed behind him, the words biting sharper than he let on. He had perfected the art of invisibility, eyes glued to the worn linoleum floor as he maneuvered through the endless sea of teenagers. Invisibility was safer. It protected him from the cruel world of high school hierarchy. Yet Lucas harbored a secret that no one, not even his parents, truly understood. The peeling paint and sweat-soaked air of a decrepit boxing gym on the outskirts of town were Lucas's true refuge. He had stumbled upon it years ago, a happenstance that changed his life. Here, he wasn't a boy trying to disappear. He was a fighter learning to stand his ground. Under the sharp guidance of Mr. Albuquerque, an old-school trainer with a gruff demeanor and a keen eye for untapped talent, Lucas found an outlet for his frustration. Every punch he threw into the battered punching bag was a silent retort to the taunts he endured daily. "You've got the strength, kid," Mr. Albuquerque would often say, leaning against the ropes of the ring with a towel slung over his shoulder. "But strength without control is like fire without a hearth. Focus." Lucas took those words to heart, pouring himself into the rhythm of the sport. The ritual of wrapping his hands, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the satisfying crack of a well-placed punch, all of it forged a version of himself he was too afraid to show the world. It was here, in the relentless grind of training, that he could breathe. But even in this haven, Lucas kept the truth hidden. His parents knew he liked to work out, but their skepticism toward boxing kept him from sharing the whole story. His father worried about injuries and bad influences, while his mother fretted over what the neighbors might say. "Why not try soccer, like the other boys?" she'd suggest, her voice heavy with concern. Lucas nodded along to avoid confrontation, but the boxing gloves in his school bag told a different story. At school, the only person who seemed to see past Lucas's self-imposed invisibility was Rafaela. With her dark, wavy hair often tucked behind her ears and a book perpetually in hand, she was as much an outlier as Lucas. They had bonded over their shared love for quiet corners and the escapism found in stories. While others saw Lucas as a lumbering shadow, Rafaela saw him as a fortress protecting something deeply fragile. "You're stronger than they'll ever know," she once told him during one of their afternoons in the library. Her words were meant to encourage, but they also carried an unintentional weight. Rafaela didn't know just how literal her statement was. As the bell rang, signaling the end of yet another grueling school day, Lucas made his way to the gym, his sanctuary. The city seemed to transform as he walked through its quieter streets. The noise of Winston High faded, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. He passed a row of graffiti-covered walls and crossed a narrow bridge that led to the gym. The building stood at the end of a dead-end street, its faded sign barely legible, Albuquerque Boxing Academy. Inside, the world changed. The scent of leather and liniment greeted him like an old friend. The rhythmic thuds of fists meeting bags filled the air, punctuated by the occasional barked instruction from Mr. Albuquerque. Lucas changed into his gear and wrapped his hands with methodical precision, the motions soothing in their familiarity. "You're late," Mr. Albuquerque said as Lucas approached the ring. His voice carried its usual gruffness, but there was no malice in it. "Got held up at school," Lucas replied, his tone as neutral as ever. The old man studied him for a moment before tossing him a pair of mitts. "Let's see what you've got today." Lucas didn't disappoint. His punches were sharp, each one delivered with purpose. The anger he bottled up all day found its release here, channeled into every jab and cross. Mr. Albuquerque nodded approvingly. "Not bad," the coach said, stepping back. "But you've got to start thinking ahead. Boxing isn't just about the next punch, it's about the one after that." Lucas wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. The words were simple, but they resonated. In the ring, as in life, anticipation was key. When the session ended, Lucas lingered by the ropes, his body sore but his mind clearer. The gym emptied out as the evening wore on, leaving only him and Mr. Albuquerque. "You know," the coach said, breaking the silence, It's okay to let people in. This sport isn't just about fighting. It's about finding out who's in your corner." Lucas didn't respond right away. He didn't know how to explain that the walls he had built around himself felt safer than any corner ever could. As he walked home under the dim glow of streetlights, Lucas couldn't shake his coach's words. His feet carried him past darkened storefronts and quiet houses, each window a portal to a life far removed from his own. When he reached his own street, the lights in his house were already off. His parents had long since gone to bed, their routines unaffected by the silent battles their son fought daily. In his room, Lucas sat on the edge of his bed, the faint glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He pulled his gloves from his bag, the leather smooth and familiar under his fingers. They were a gift from his grandfather, a man he barely remembered but whose presence lingered in the stories his father told. He traced the worn stitching of the gloves, their weight both comforting and suffocating. They were more than tools for a sport. They were symbols of the strength he aspired to, the resilience he needed. Yet tonight, as he stared at them, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. Lucas placed the gloves on his desk and turned off the light. The darkness enveloped him, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the exhaustion that came from carrying so much. Tomorrow, he would face another day of whispers, stares, and the constant effort to remain unseen. But tonight, in the solitude of his room, he could rest. Unbeknownst to him, the tide was beginning to turn. Forces beyond his control were aligning, and soon, Lucas would have no choice but to step out of the shadows he had so carefully crafted. The corridors of Winston High were a battlefield, and Lucas Mendez was the ideal prey. The school's social hierarchy revolved around a well-oiled machine of dominance and submission, with Davi Martins reigning as its unchallenged king. As captain of the football team, Davi wielded power like a weapon, his charm masking the cruelty that lurked beneath. Flanked by his loyal lackeys Gabriel and Vinicius, he made sure everyone knew their place. For Lucas, his silence and sighs painted a target on his back, an unspoken invitation for torment. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A whisper here, a snicker there. Davi had a knack for weaponizing his charisma, using laughter as ammunition. "Hey, big guy," he'd call out in the hallways, his tone syrupy and mock-friendly. "You left your shadow in the cafeteria. Maybe eat that too next time." The remark would trigger a ripple of laughter, the kind that crawled under Lucas's skin and stayed there. Gabriel's role was to amplify Davi's words, his loud cackling echoing like a signal to the rest of the school that Lucas was fair game. Vinicius, on the other hand, rarely joined in with the same enthusiasm. His discomfort was evident in the way his gaze would falter during these encounters, but his loyalty to Davi kept him tethered to the group. For Lucas, it didn't matter who laughed or who stayed quiet. It all blended into a singular wave of humiliation. The gym was Lucas's only sanctuary. Its faded walls and dim lighting stood in stark contrast to the fluorescent glare of Winston High, and here, the only sounds were the rhythmic thuds of fists meeting bags and the occasional bark of Mr. Albuquerque's commands. Lucas found solace in the structure, in the simplicity of focusing solely on his next move. But even the gym couldn't keep the shadows of Davi and his crew from creeping in. "Keep your head down, Mendez," Mr. Albuquerque had warned him one evening after noticing the frustration in Lucas's punches. "A fight's not worth losing yourself over." But how much could one boy endure? The torment escalated. Davi's barbs turned sharper, the pranks crueler. One morning, Lucas opened his locker to find it stuffed with shredded paper, the remnants of what used to be his notebook. Written across the scraps in black marker was a single word: loser. Rafaela found him as he hastily gathered the pieces, his face flushed with a mix of anger and shame. "Lucas," she said softly, crouching beside him, "you need to report this." He shook his head, his jaw tight. "It won't change anything. They'll just find another way." Her eyes searched his face, looking for some crack in his resolve. She wanted to say more, but knew it would fall on deaf ears. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. But Lucas felt alone. Even surrounded by people who claimed to care, he was trapped in an endless cycle of enduring and evading. He couldn't show his parents. They wouldn't understand. He couldn't confide in Mr. Albuquerque. He had drilled into him the importance of restraint. And he couldn't let Rafaela bear the weight of his struggles. The next attack was less subtle. During lunch, Davi sauntered past Lucas's table and accidentally knocked his tray onto the floor. The loud clatter of the tray hitting the ground was followed by the unmistakable splatter of spaghetti sauce against Lucas's shoes. "Oops," Davi said with an exaggerated shrug, smirking as he towered over Lucas. "Guess those big feet got in the way." Lucas's hands balled into fists under the table, but he stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the mess. His mind raced with everything he wanted to do. Every punch he had perfected in the gym screamed for release. But he stayed still, swallowing his pride along with his anger. The laughter that followed cut deeper than any insult. That evening at the gym, Lucas's punches were wild, unfocused. His knuckles stung from the force, the worn leather of the punching bag giving way under his frustration. "What's gotten into you?" Mr. Albuquerque demanded, stepping into the ring. "You're swinging like you've got nothing to lose." Lucas stopped mid-punch, his breath heaving. "They're not going to stop," he said finally, his voice cracking. "No matter what I do, they'll keep coming." The coach's eyes softened, a rare crack in his stern demeanor. "Kid, people like that, they thrive on reactions. Give them none, and eventually, they'll run out of steam." Lucas wanted to believe him, but the weight of Davi's reign felt insurmountable. He left the gym that night feeling heavier than when he arrived. The next day, Lucas sat at his usual spot in the library during lunch, hoping to avoid another incident. Rafaela slid into the seat across from him, a book in her hand and concern etched across her face. "I heard about yesterday," she said cautiously. "Let it go, Rafaela," he replied, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. She set the book down, folding her hands over it. "I can't just stand by and watch this happen. You deserve better." Lucas looked at her, his defenses wavering. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice softening. "You don't understand what it's like to walk into a room and feel like you don't belong." "Maybe I don't," she admitted, her voice steady. "But I know what it's like to care about someone who doesn't see their own worth." Her words lingered as the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Lucas walked to his next class feeling an unfamiliar mix of shame and gratitude. The storm finally broke on a Friday afternoon. As Lucas approached his locker, he noticed something hanging from the latch. His breath caught when he realized it was his boxing gloves, his prized possession, ripped and slashed. A note dangled from one of the shredded laces. "Not so tough now, are you?" Lucas stood frozen, the world around him blurring as rage boiled to the surface. This wasn't just bullying, it was a declaration of war. He clenched the gloves in his hands, the weight of them anchoring him in place. When Rafaela found him minutes later, he was still standing there, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions. "Lucas," she said cautiously, reaching out to touch his arm. "They went too far," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm done pretending this doesn't matter." For the first time, Rafaela didn't try to calm him down. She simply nodded, her grip on his arm firm. "Then let's figure out how to stop them." Lucas met her gaze, a flicker of determination breaking through the cloud of anger. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't completely alone. The air in the gym was stifling, heavy with the smell of sweat and frustration. Lucas hammered at the heavy bag, his fists colliding with the worn leather in a furious rhythm. Each punch reverberated through his arms, but it wasn't enough to drain the anger swirling inside him. The torn gloves, the mocking note, the endless taunts, they all churned in his mind like a storm, refusing to settle. "Enough." Mr. Albuquerque's voice cut through the sound of Lucas's fists meeting the bag. The coach stepped forward, his expression a mix of concern and irritation. "You're going to hurt yourself, kid. Take a break." Lucas reluctantly stopped, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his knuckles throbbed beneath the wraps. "They ruined everything," he muttered, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Mr. Albuquerque crossed his arms, leaning against the ropes of the nearest ring. "What happened?" Lucas hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Davi. His goons. They destroyed my gloves. They've been pushing me around for years, and now they're taking the only thing that keeps me sane. The coach's expression hardened. And you think punching that bag into oblivion is going to fix it? It's all I can do, Lucas snapped. You're the one who told me to keep my head down, to avoid confrontation. Look where that's gotten me. Mr. Albuquerque studied him for a moment, his gaze piercing. I told you to pick your battles, Lucas. I never said to let people walk all over you. There's a difference. Lucas's anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. What am I supposed to do then? Fight them? Get expelled? Prove them right? No, Albuquerque said, his tone firm. You fight smart. You fight when it matters. And you never let them control how you feel. The words lingered in the air as Lucas leaned against the heavy bag, his body still trembling from the adrenaline. He knew the coach was right, but the thought of facing Davi again filled him with dread. The bully wasn't just strong, he was manipulative, capable of rallying others to his side. How could Lucas, with all his training, hope to win a battle that wasn't fought with fists alone? That night, as Lucas walked home, he couldn't shake the weight of the coach's words. The streets were quiet, illuminated by the flickering glow of streetlights. His mind churned with scenarios, each more desperate than the last. He couldn't keep enduring this, not for himself and not for Rafaela, who had been dragged into his mess simply by caring. When he reached his room, Lucas sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the remnants of his gloves. The leather was beyond repair, the cuts jagged and cruel. He ran his fingers over the torn seams, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and sorrow. These gloves had been a gift from his grandfather, a man who had always believed in standing up for what was right. Now, they were a symbol of everything Lucas had lost. The following day, Lucas approached school with a simmering determination. He had spent the night thinking, replaying every moment of torment in his mind. The humiliation, the anger, the helplessness, it all came to a head when he saw Davi and his lackeys lounging by the lockers, their laughter grating against his nerves. Davi noticed Lucas immediately, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "Hey, big guy," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You miss your gloves? Don't worry, we'll find you a new pair. Maybe something pink to match your style." Gabriel burst into laughter, his voice echoing through the hallway. Vinicius smirked but avoided Lucas's gaze. Lucas stopped in his tracks, his fists tightening at his sides. For the first time in years, he didn't look away. His gaze locked with Davi's, and something shifted in the air. The smug confidence in Davi's eyes wavered, just for a moment, as he registered the change in Lucas's demeanor. "Leave me alone," Lucas said, his voice steady but laced with warning. Davi raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Or what? You gonna hit me, tough guy? Go ahead. See what happens." The challenge hung between them, a spark threatening to ignite the powder keg of tension that had been building for years. Lucas's heart pounded, but he forced himself to breathe, to think. He wasn't going to let Davi bait him, not like this. Instead of responding, Lucas turned and walked away, his steps deliberate. He could hear the laughter behind him, but it didn't sting as much as it used to. Something inside him had shifted, and he wasn't going to let Davi win, not on his terms. When Lucas met Rafaela in the library later, she noticed the change immediately. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face for clues. "I'm done running," Lucas said simply, his voice firm. "But I'm not going to stoop to their level." Rafaela nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You've got a plan." "Not yet," Lucas admitted. "But I'll figure it out." Over the next few days, Lucas focused on training, channeling his anger and frustration into every punch and every movement. Mr. Albuquerque noticed the shift and pushed him harder, challenging him to refine his technique and control his emotions. "Discipline," the coach reminded him. "It's what separates a fighter from a brawler." Lucas took the words to heart, honing not just his skills but his mindset. He wasn't going to let Davi dictate his life any longer. And as he prepared for what he knew would be an inevitable confrontation, Lucas felt a strength he hadn't known before, a strength that came not from his fists, but from within. The storm was far from over, but for the first time, Lucas felt ready to face it. The tension in the air was palpable as Lucas exited the school building that Friday afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Students lingered in small groups, their laughter and chatter a distant hum. Lucas kept his focus ahead, determined to avoid any confrontation, but his gut told him something was coming. He could feel the weight of unspoken conflict pressing down on him. It happened as he approached the bike rack near the main courtyard. A sudden shove from behind sent him stumbling forward. He caught himself just before falling, his bag slipping off his shoulder and hitting the ground. When he turned, he saw Davi, flanked by Gabriel and Vinicius. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the promise of spectacle. "Thought you'd just walk away, huh?" Davi sneered, his voice loud enough to ensure everyone could hear. "Big guy thinks he's too good to answer me now." Lucas straightened, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see Gabriel's smug grin, the way Vinicius shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. The crowd whispered in anticipation, their phones discreetly raised to capture whatever would happen next. "I don't want any trouble, Davi," Lucas said, keeping his voice calm and even. "Trouble?" Davi laughed, stepping closer. "You think I'm giving you a choice? You've been walking around here like you're better than us. Time someone knocked you back down." Before Lucas could respond, Davi's hand slammed into his chest, shoving him hard against the metal bike rack. The crowd gasped, and Lucas felt the cold steel dig into his back. He clenched his fists but didn't retaliate, his mind racing with Mr. Albuquerque's advice. "Fight smart. Do something," Davi challenged, his face inches from Lucas's. "Come on, tough guy. Let's see if all that size means anything." Lucas's breaths came in shallow bursts. His instincts screamed at him to fight back, to end this once and for all. But he hesitated, knowing that if he threw the first punch, it would only play into Davi's hands. Davi didn't wait. He threw a wild right hook, aiming for Lucas's jaw. But Lucas had trained for moments like this. He ducked, the punch grazing past his ear, and instinctively stepped to the side. Davi stumbled, momentarily off balance, and Lucas used the opportunity to create some distance. The crowd erupted in shouts, their excitement mounting. "Get him, Davi," someone yelled. "Stay down, Lucas," came another voice. Gabriel moved to block Lucas's escape, his arms crossed and a cocky smirk on his face. "Where do you think you're going?" Lucas's mind was laser-focused. He couldn't afford to panic, not now. He had spent years learning how to control his movements, how to conserve energy and strike with precision. But this wasn't a controlled environment. There were no rules here, only the chaotic energy of a mob hungry for entertainment. Davi came at him again, this time with more calculated aggression. Lucas sidestepped another punch, his movements fluid and deliberate. The crowd's noise blurred into the background as he focused on his opponent. For the first time, Davi looked frustrated, his confidence faltering. "You scared?" Davi taunted, his breath heavy. "All that training for nothing?" Lucas didn't answer. Instead, he planted his feet firmly and waited for the next attack. When it came, a clumsy lunge driven more by rage than skill, Lucas acted on instinct. He caught Davi's wrist mid-swing and twisted, using the bully's momentum against him. Davi stumbled forward, crashing into a row of bikes with a loud clang. The crowd fell silent, the tension snapping like a taut wire. Gabriel and Vinicius exchanged uncertain glances, their leader sprawled on the ground, momentarily stunned. Lucas stepped back, his breathing steady, his eyes locked on Davi. "It's over," Lucas said, his voice low but firm. "Walk away." Davi scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and fury. "You think this is over?" he spat, brushing dirt off his shirt. "This is just the beginning." Lucas stood his ground, his muscles coiled and ready for whatever came next. But Davi hesitated, his bravado faltering under the weight of the crowd's expectant stares. The bully glanced at Gabriel, who gave him a reluctant shrug, and at Vinicius, whose eyes were fixed on the ground. Without another word, Davi shoved past his lackeys and stormed off, his shoulders tense with unspent rage. Gabriel lingered for a moment, his smirk replaced by a look of uncertainty, before following. Vinicius trailed behind, his gaze briefly meeting Lucas's before he disappeared into the dispersing crowd. Lucas let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline leaving his body all at once. The students around him began to murmur, their voices a mix of admiration and disbelief. He ignored them, focusing instead on the bike rack where his bag still lay. He picked it up and slung it over his shoulder, his hands trembling. "Lucas!" Rafaela's voice cut through the noise. She pushed through the remnants of the crowd, her face pale with worry. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. His mind was still reeling, his body aching from the confrontation. "I'm fine," he managed, his voice hoarse. She studied him, her eyes searching for any sign of injury. "That was brave," she said finally. "But what if he comes back?" "He will," Lucas said quietly. "But next time, I'll be ready." They walked away together, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Lucas knew this wasn't the end. Davi wouldn't let this go, not without retaliation. But for the first time in years, Lucas felt a glimmer of hope. He had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for the boy who had spent too long hiding in the shadows. As they reached the edge of the school grounds, Lucas glanced back at the now empty courtyard. The fight wasn't over, but something had shifted. He wasn't the same person who had been shoved into lockers and mocked in hallways. He was stronger now, not just in body but in spirit. And he wasn't going to back down. The video spread faster than Lucas could have imagined. By the time he arrived at school Monday morning, the hallways were buzzing with whispered conversations and stolen glances in his direction. Someone had recorded the confrontation with Davi, and now every student at Winston High seemed to have watched Lucas take a stand. He felt the shift the moment he stepped through the doors. The usual jeers and sneers were replaced by cautious nods and murmurs. For the first time in years, Lucas wasn't invisible, but the attention made him uneasy. His entire life at Winston High had been about avoiding notice, and now he was at the center of a storm. "Lucas!" Rafaela's voice called from behind him as she jogged to catch up. She looked more excited than worried, a rarity in recent weeks. "Have you seen the comments? People are saying you're a hero." "I didn't do it to be a hero," Lucas muttered, adjusting the strap of his bag. "I just wanted him to stop." "Well, it worked," she said, falling into step beside him. "I heard Davi hasn't shown up yet. Guess he's not used to being humiliated." Lucas's stomach twisted at her words. Humiliation. That wasn't what he'd wanted. Davi's pride had been wounded in front of the entire school, and Lucas knew that kind of injury didn't heal quietly. As the day wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. In every class, students whispered behind him, their gazes darting his way whenever he shifted in his seat. Even the teachers seemed to tread carefully around him, their usual reprimands softened, as though they too had seen the video and weren't sure how to address the sudden change in Lucas's status. By lunchtime, the tension was unbearable. Lucas sat with Rafaela in their usual spot in the library, but the quiet that once comforted him now felt oppressive. "Do you think he's planning something?" Rafaela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably," Lucas admitted, his fingers tracing the edge of his notebook. "Guys like Davi don't just let things go." "Then we need to be prepared," she said firmly. "You can't face him alone next time." Lucas looked at her, surprised by the determination in her voice. "I've been doing this alone for years," he said. "I can handle it." "But you shouldn't have to," Rafaela shot back. "You've already shown everyone you're strong. Now it's time to let others help." Her words lingered with him long after she left for her next class. The truth was, he didn't know how to let people in. Even now, with the school watching his every move, Lucas felt like the same isolated kid who had spent years hiding behind silence and avoidance. That evening, as he entered the gym, Mr. Albuquerque was waiting for him. The old coach leaned against the ropes of the ring, a knowing look in his eyes. "Had a feeling I'd be seeing you today," he said as Lucas approached. "I needed to clear my head," Lucas admitted, setting his bag down by the bench. The coach motioned for him to step into the ring. "Good. Because I've got something to show you." Lucas climbed through the ropes, the familiar creak of the canvas beneath his feet grounding him. Mr. Albuquerque held up a pair of pads, nodding for Lucas to position himself. "Focus," the coach instructed as Lucas began throwing punches. "I saw the video. You kept your cool, stayed on your feet. That's good. But you need to think about what happens next." Lucas hesitated mid-swing, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "Davi's not the type to give up," Albuquerque said, lowering the pads. "You embarrassed him, and he's going to want payback. The question is, are you ready for that?" Lucas stepped back, his breathing steady despite the weight of the coach's words. "I don't want to fight him." "Sometimes, the fight comes to you," Albuquerque said. "And when it does, you don't just stand there waiting. You take control." Lucas nodded slowly, the truth sinking in. He couldn't keep hoping Davi would leave him alone. If another confrontation came, he had to be ready, not just physically, but mentally. The next morning, the tension at school was even thicker. Davi had returned, and his presence was impossible to ignore. He moved through the halls with a coiled energy, his expression dark and unreadable. Gabriel and Vinicius flanked him as usual, their loyalty unshaken despite their leader's fall from grace. Lucas avoided him as best he could, but the atmosphere felt like the calm before a storm. Every glance in Davi's direction was met with a scowl. Every whispered conversation in the hall was filled with speculation about when the next clash would occur. It came during the last class of the day. Lucas was gathering his things when the classroom door slammed open, startling everyone inside. Davi stood in the doorway, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. "Outside," he growled, his eyes locking onto Lucas. The room fell silent. The teacher froze mid-sentence, her eyes darting nervously between the two boys. "Davi, I don't think." "This doesn't concern you," Davi snapped, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Let's go, Mendez. Unless you're scared." Lucas hesitated, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, the unspoken expectation that he would rise to the challenge. He didn't want to fight, but he knew walking away now would only make things worse. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Fine," he said, his voice steady. "Let's get this over with." The class erupted into hushed whispers as Lucas followed Davi out into the hallway. Students spilled out of nearby classrooms, drawn by the commotion. The crowd that formed was even larger than before, their phones at the ready to capture every moment. As they stepped into the courtyard, Lucas felt the cold bite of the autumn air against his skin. Davi turned to face him, his posture tense, his eyes blazing with anger. "You made me look like a fool," Davi spat. "Now I'm going to remind everyone who's in charge." Lucas didn't flinch. "You don't scare me anymore, Davi." The bully sneered, his fists tightening. "Then let's see how long that lasts." Lucas shifted his weight, his training kicking in. He wouldn't throw the first punch, he wouldn't give Davi the satisfaction. But as the crowd pressed in, their voices a cacophony of anticipation, Lucas knew this would be the fight that changed everything. The courtyard was a charged arena, its usual bustle now replaced with a tense silence. A ring of students formed instinctively, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their phones. All eyes were locked on Lucas and Davi, two figures standing in stark contrast, one calm and resolute, the other seething with unchecked fury. Davi cracked his knuckles, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "You've got guts, Mendez," he sneered, pacing in a tight circle. "But I'm going to remind everyone why they don't cross me." Lucas stood his ground, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing controlled. His training echoed in his mind. Stay balanced. Watch his movements. Wait for the right moment. But this wasn't a sparring session, and the stakes felt higher than any bout he'd faced in the gym. "Just walk away, Davi," Lucas said, his voice steady but firm. It doesn't have to end like this. Davi's laugh was sharp and humorless. Oh, it's ending. Right here, right now. The first punch came without warning, a wide, reckless swing aimed at Lucas's jaw. But Lucas was ready. He ducked low, the punch sailing harmlessly over his head, and took a step back, forcing Davi to overextend and stumble. The crowd gasped, the sound rippling outward like a wave. "Fight back!" someone shouted from the crowd, but Lucas ignored it. He wasn't here to entertain. He was here to stand his ground. Davi recovered quickly, his frustration evident in the way his fists clenched tighter. He charged again, this time throwing a series of wild jabs. Lucas deflected the first, sidestepped the second, and let the third hit nothing but air. With every missed swing, Davi's anger grew, his attacks becoming more erratic. "Stay still, you coward!" Davi barked, his voice cracking under the strain of his fury. "You're losing control," Lucas said evenly, his eyes locked on Davi's every move. "You can't win like this." The words only fueled Davi's rage. He lunged forward, both fists raised, but Lucas stepped to the side and countered with a quick shove, sending Davi sprawling to the ground. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps, the spectacle more intense than anyone had anticipated. Davi scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation. Gabriel and Vinicius lingered at the edge of the circle, their expressions a mix of concern and hesitation. For the first time, it seemed they were questioning their allegiance. "Stay out of this!" Davi snapped at them, his voice a sharp command. The two boys froze, their loyalty tethered by fear more than friendship. Lucas's voice cut through the chaos. "It's over, Davi. You've lost. Not until you're on the ground." Davi roared, charging once more. This time, Lucas didn't step back. He planted his feet, dodged the incoming punch with a swift turn, and delivered a precise strike to Davi's shoulder, not hard enough to cause injury, but enough to throw him off balance. Davi stumbled again, his frustration boiling over as he let out a guttural yell. "You're done!" Davi screamed, swinging wildly. But Lucas stayed composed, weaving through the attacks like water around rocks. Each missed punch drained Davi's energy, his movements slowing as exhaustion set in. Finally, Davi collapsed to his knees, his breaths ragged, his fists shaking at his sides. The crowd fell silent, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Lucas stepped back, his stance relaxed but firm, his expression unreadable. "Enough," Lucas said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm not here to hurt you, Davi. I just want this to stop." Davi looked up, his face a mix of anger and defeat. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, he lowered his head, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his humiliation. The crowd began to dissipate, the spectacle over, the tension easing with every passing second. Gabriel and Vinicius exchanged a glance before stepping forward to help Davi to his feet. He shrugged them off at first, but eventually allowed their support as they guided him away without another word. Rafaela appeared at Lucas's side, her expression a mix of relief and pride. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Lucas nodded, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Yeah, I'm fine." She smiled, a rare moment of lightness breaking through the heavy atmosphere. "You did it. You stood up to him." "It wasn't just about me," Lucas said, his gaze following Davi as he disappeared into the distance. "It was about making sure no one else has to go through this." The weight of his words lingered as they walked back inside. Lucas knew the fight wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. And while the battle was over, the war against the culture of fear Davi had built would take time to dismantle. The next day, the principal called Lucas into his office. The video of the confrontation had reached faculty members, and while the outcome was clear, Lucas was prepared for consequences. To his surprise, the principal acknowledged the years of bullying Lucas had endured and assured him that steps were being taken to create a safer environment for all students. In the weeks that followed, the school began implementing new measures: anti-bullying workshops, a mentorship program, and even a self-defense class led by Mr. Albuquerque. Lucas, hesitant at first, agreed to assist with the classes, finding purpose in helping others learn to stand up for themselves. The atmosphere at Winston High began to shift. The whispers of fear that had once dominated the hallways were replaced with a sense of solidarity. Davi kept a low profile, his reign of terror effectively dismantled, while Gabriel and Vinicius distanced themselves, seemingly eager to start fresh. For Lucas, life didn't become perfect overnight, but it was better. He found strength not just in himself, but in the community that had begun to form around him. And as he stood in the gym one evening, watching a group of students throw their first punches under Mr. Albuquerque's watchful eye, Lucas felt a deep sense of pride. "You've come a long way, kid," Albuquerque said, clapping a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "But the real fight is always ahead." Lucas nodded, his eyes focused and determined. "I'm ready." And for the first time, he truly was. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.